G'day Year 11, welcome back. Hope you had a good weekend. What we're going to look at this week is continuing on with personal and social identity, how we become functioning members of society and things like that. What we're going to look at today is the nature versus nurture debate. Very interesting stuff here. So that is your syllabus dot point. I'll just get up our syllabus so we know what page that's on. Have a gaze. There it is, page 31 of your syllabus. So go to 31 of your syllabus, it's about halfway down, and it's this dot point here. The nature versus nurture debate. So I want you to look at that and highlight it, get it as a heading, and we'll get started. So copy this down. As usual, you'll need your books, pens, etc. With nature, we're sort of going to look at that in comparison to nurture, but we'll start with nature. So nature is sort of our pre-wiring, as I've written there. It's our biology, genetics, DNA, and all those sort of qualities we got from our parents that make us who we are. It's very much, if you want to think of it, a lot of it's got to do with the physical aspects of who we are, like the colour of our eyes, how tall we are, how short we are, you know, what colour your hair is, but it's also got a lot to do, especially nowadays with science and technology, we understand these ideas of genetics and DNA a bit more. So let's say, for example, if your family has a certain type of history of cancers or something like that, because of your DNA, genetics and biology, you're more likely, not saying you will or are going to get it, but you are more likely to get it because of that family history of it. That's also part of nature as well. It also sort of looks at our natural path, or what we call sort of the human instinct, that flight or fight response and that gut feeling that you can have sometimes. A lot of that is very much nature focused, so it's kind of looking at your base level instincts, your hunch, how you appropriately react or disreact to something. So let's say, like, for thousands and thousands of years, humans have reacted to danger in a certain way. Okay, we get our bodies pump with a certain amount of adrenaline. We have naturally a certain stress level or triggers, and that's been passed down for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, sort of thing. So nature's definitely a very powerful element or force in shaping our identity and who we are for that reason. A lot of it as well, in terms of how this relates to our identity, nature determines our sort of distinctive features, quite literally, eye colour, height, that kind of thing, but also in terms of who you are and how you identify yourself. So there's certainly nurture elements to this, but there's a lot of nature elements to being male or female. So for example, if you're born your anatomical sex being male, you've got more testosterone in your sort of system or your bodily makeup than a female would. In the reverse role, females will have more estrogen in their systems, and those hormones can sort of affect different types of behaviours. So if we look at testosterone, for example, that can affect behaviours such as, if you look at the stats of drink driving and violent sort of crime, the majority of that is done by males. I'm not saying it's purely down to testosterone, but the nature of their genetic makeup sort of pre-wires them more prone to things like that. And that's just the bad side of it. There are other good sides of it as well, but that was just an example. That idea of genetic makeup that determines our behaviour as well. So like I was saying, so males were seen as sort of the hunter, gatherer, protector and provider across many cultures all over the world throughout time, whereas women in those cultures were seen in that first nature side of it as the kind of collector, nurturer and responsible for taking care of the family. Now, if we look at how that concept of nature has changed over time, there's been, especially in the last 150 years, but especially in the last 50, there's been a large shift in the nature, or how our pre-wiring is disposing us in how we view sex and the role of sex. So, for example, males can now be seen in the traditionally female role, and females can now be seen in the traditionally male role. Whether or not, though, that's an effect more of the nurture side of things, we'll look at a bit later. But that's sort of nature as its whole. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Again, some examples of nature we've talked about here: eye colour, straight or curly hair, pigmentation of your skin, all that kind of thing. Here's a more detailed analysis of it as well. Now, I don't mean you get this whole thing down, but I would like you to take away maybe 3 key points from it as some sort of strict examples of what nature can be. So this is sort of what experts in the field are saying. So here we're looking at a lot of people speculating whether physiological characteristics such as behaviour and personality, actually get this whole first paragraph down, that's probably ideal. So that idea that our behaviour, it's not just our looks, it's not just how tall we are or whether our hair's straight or curly, it's also our sort of mental and personality attributes that a lot of psychologists are sort of saying these days are more wired in than we think we were, or than they think they were. So that's, again, that sort of tendency of, if you have like, you might find certain families have all certain job fields because that matches their personality style the best. Or you might find if, there's a violent kid at school, their parents might be a bit more lenient, or not lenient, a bit more prone to being violent themselves. So it's not just our physical characteristics, but our psychological characteristics as well. So that sort of take on it is really big on this idea of a nativist. This bit isn't necessarily essential to know, but it's interesting, this idea that humans are purely nature. We are who we are. There's nothing else that could influence it. Everything that happens or everything that a person behaves is because that's just who they are. That's sort of the idea of that paragraph, or that's the theory of that. So a lot of us are saying that in terms of nature, a bit more evidence that it's not just our physical attributes is that there's this... Actually, so I want you to get down this. Don't worry about that one. But get down those two, all those. So something to support this kind of theory is that there are certain characteristics that we can't observe at birth, but they appear later on in the way that the majority of people, it happens to them when they mature. So, for example, the idea that elderly people get grumpier as they get older, that's a very common thing that happens, but it's not necessarily something that's observable straight away, and it's not something that's a physical in nature. It's very psychological. So it's almost like saying we have this inner biological clock, and it switches on and off with different types of behaviour that's pre-programmed in. So like this idea that when you become a parent, this biological clock kicks in and you become more mature because you're looking after and responsible for a little human. Even all these things, another classic example is through puberty. When adolescents are going through puberty, the types of behaviour changes they experience because of all the bodily changes in their body is affecting their psychological characteristics and how they behave. So I guess what I'm trying to get the point is that nature is really complex. It's not just the physical elements of it, but it's also the non-physical elements that can affect it as well. It's quite complex. So yeah, here's to the nurture side of it. So we're sort of looking here at external factors, things that have shaped who we are that aren't necessarily related to our genetics, biology, or DNA. We're looking at all these outside influences. So we'd call them external factors. They can be from micro, meso, and macro world. But these are things like the way our parents raise us, so their beliefs and values, what they teach us as we grow up. You've also got life experiences that can shape you. So if you've ever had a life-changing experience, that can change who you are, and that could change your identity, and that's got nothing to do with nature. It's purely based off something you've witnessed or something you've gone through that not everyone else has gone through, but it still shapes and changes who you are. And also behaviour that is learnt through conditioning is nurture. So that's when you train your body to form a habit, for example. So the behaviour of, say, professional athletes, or when they go to do a certain skill relating to their support, they've practiced that, conditioned that into their body, and that's changing their identity and how they behave and react. Similar to even me teaching, or even you as a student. A lot of the time you won't even think about walking into a classroom, putting your bag down, sitting up straight, and all this sort of things that you probably would have thought really closely about in Year 7 or when you first went to school. So our identity in terms of nature can also be shaped by our environment. So for example, the role of hunters and warriors is not universally male dominated, as the nature theory sort of suggests, because there's a lot of historical evidence even where you've got societies of women who were the fighters, and the men that stayed at home. So this sort of would suggest that these roles are culturally determined as opposed to being biological. So by culturally determined, I mean it's people's beliefs and opinions on how they view, say, gender or gender roles, for example. That is the reason why males and females are more likely to do one thing or another, not because of it's part of their genetics or DNA. Does that make sense? So it's almost like the opposite end. So they are a bit different. So examples, or more examples of nurture, are things like your values and beliefs, how you behave, your morals, your moral compass, all that kind of thing. If we're going to go through this in a bit more detail, what I want you to get from here is, I'll just quickly scan it. Get all that. That's all good. Get all that down. Yeah. So looking at it more in detail, there's this basic assumption that at birth, according to the nurture theory, that the human mind's a blank slate, and that as we grow up, we're sort of filled, and our mind is filled up. Think of it like a bucket. So like you got a drip from your parents, drips from your friends, drips from school. All these sorts of different things are filling up your experience and exposure to the world and how you view the world, and that will in turn shape your identity and how you view and see things. It's not necessarily everything that's happening is because you're wired a certain way. It's everything is happening to you based off your experiences and how you're choosing to react to them, based off how culture and society has shaped you. Hope that makes sense. So from this point of view, we're looking at very much that psychological characteristics and behaviours are the results of learning. I would highlight that. They're the result of teaching of other people. Again, like I said, the influence of culture and society on us, not that we're born with it. It's almost how you're brought up, so the nurture that governs these aspects of you. And the concept of being mature applies only to the biological. So they're saying that, like, the fact that when you get older, the only nature side of it, according to the nurture theory, is you're getting wrinkles as you're older. Your bones start to fray because that's just how it is. Whereas your mind and things like that, you become more mature because you have more life experience, and that's why older people tend to be more wise, or they tend to have more answers and knowledge than a younger person would, because they, again, have been exposed to the world a lot more. An example of this was there was a learning theory that suggested aggression was learnt from environment through observation and imitation. So that earlier example I looked at, whereas say, if you know of anyone who's violent and you know them quite well, and then their parents might be more prone to violence or aggression, nature says that that's just part of their DNA or genetics, but the nurture side of the argument is saying that that's a learnt behaviour, and that, say, the kid of someone who's violent becomes violent not because they're born to be and they're destined to be, but because they are observing that behaviour and imitating it and learning from that. Language was another one, so your body language, even how you speak, like literal language and in terms of linguistics and things like that. So it's very interesting to sort of compare the two and see how they go. Alright, what I want you to do now, there's two really good YouTube videos that I want you to have a look at. So again, they're looking at nature versus nurture. This first one is more on the nurture side of things, and I might highlight that because it emphasizes it. Whereas this second one's more about nature. And they're both very interesting arguments. So both of them use monkeys as their experiment. So this one, I mean, this experiment wouldn't be legal today, but back in the, I don't know, like 60 years ago, 70 years ago, this guy called Harlow did a monkey experiment. He's got two monkeys hooked up, or two fake monkeys, sorry, hooked up to different machines, and he ends up scaring this little monkey to see whether it runs to a more nurture model or a more nature model. So have a look at that. It's really interesting in terms of what our prime instincts go to. And then if we look at the next clip, this one is an idea of looking at children's toys. So they give a bunch of a bunch of boy toys and girl toys traditionally, and scatter them amongst a zoo plot that's full of monkeys. And what they found was that all of the monkeys that were male dominated towards and led towards the trucks, the hammers, that kind of things, whereas all the female monkeys were picking the dresses and the dolls and trying to nurse them. So that was more of a nature side of things. So watch them both, they're quite interesting. Once you've done that, I want you to create a nature versus nurture table. So what that would look like if I was to draw one up here. Set table. Boom, boom. So you'll have. Just highlight that so the lines are a bit clearer. So you might have nature here, and then nurture here. And what I want you to do is list each of these sort of characteristics. Do they belong in nature or do they belong in nurture? I want you to make that call. So do you think intelligence is something that someone's born with, or it's something that they learn over time based off their experience? Same thing with personality, sexuality, occupation, health, talent. I want you to make a call on it. Try as best you can to box it in. Of course, you may think, it's both. It really depends on the situation. But I want you to try your best to put them into a category, and then write down why you've put it in that category more so than the other. No, I'm not saying that you're ignoring that it doesn't have influence outside of whichever category you put it in, but it would be interesting to see what you think there. After you've done that, I want you to go to slide 11. I want you to consider this scenario. So baby's crying in the middle of the night. The child has just been fed, but as one of the parents gets up to see their child to fix them up because they're crying, their partner says, "Don't spoil him, just let him cry himself to sleep." So this idea, I suppose, is trying to grapple whether you're more nurture or nature orientated. So do you think a baby can be spoiled? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you would go up to nurse the baby, if it was crying, you're more nurture focused. But if you're, in this particular example anyway, but if you're looking at letting the baby cry themselves back to sleep, you're more nature focused, because the idea is that the baby would just lull itself back to sleep as it should, So have a think about that. And then lastly, I want you to tell me whether you think nature or nurture has been more impactful on your life. Now, often it's hard to sort of tell which influences which, but have a think about it, and I want you to use some examples to support your answer. So, for example, you might say, I think nurture has been more significant on my life because I believe in this, and this, which my parents did. Or you might say, I believe in all of these things and my parents don't, and that's how I know it is nurture, because if it was nature, I'm supposed to be just like them, okay? Or you might look at the nature aspect of it and see that you are just like your parents, and you can sort of see that why you are that way is because there are certain elements of you that were born that way. So have a think about it. It'd be interesting to see what you come up with. That's it. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.